Hello, and welcome to Topic 12, Lecture 2. And in this, we're going to take a look at the history of correctional institutions. As you will read in your textbook, historically, legal punishments, so when you look at sort of like the history of punishments, both in the United States and in Europe, that legal punishments really didn't include incarceration. Using incarceration, isolating somebody from society within a state-controlled or state-run institution, that's a relatively modern phenomenon. As your textbook points out, other punishments such as banishment, so being exiled from the community, slavery as a punishment, restitution, that is, you have to pay the family or the person that you harmed, bodily punishment, corporal punishment, and execution. Those were the main types of punishment in the United States. Imprisonment as a punishment really didn't become the norm until the 19th century or the early 1800s. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some institutions that held people in confinement. Your textbook talks about how in Europe prisons were used, but they weren't used as a form of punishment. You weren't sentenced to incapacitation, but rather prisons were used as jails, and so that people were who were committed crimes and had been found guilty, they were detained until their punishment. And whether that punishment would have been execution or some sort of bodily punishment like mutilation or flagellation or, the stocks, whatever it might be, that it was like you were detained until punished. If you were executed, that was that. And then once punished, you were let go. And these early prisons that were used as not a form of punishment, but as a form of detention, you'll read about it. They were deplorable places, sort of sound like our jails today, that they were run by fee or for profit by the sheriffs. And so the more people you had in there, the more money you would make, and that they were kind of catch-all institutions. So it wasn't just people who had committed crimes, but people who were poor, debtors, those who mentally ill, they would all sort of end up in these prisons. But those kinds of prisons that were for detention aren't really a reflection of the modern penal institutions that we have today that are focused on incapacitation as a form of punishment. So the early prisons that we have in America are come forth in the colonial times in the United States. So this is when states weren't states, but they were colonies. And so your textbook talks about one of the first prisons was in Virginia, but it's really the Pennsylvania that is identified as leading the way in terms of creating the first correctional facilities. And these early prisons in America took place in the 1700s, so the 1710s and 20s. So, the Revolutionary War, the American colonies declare independence in 1776, right? And then they, fight a war, win it in 1781. So just to kind of give you a sense that that's like sort of like, several decades prior to the revolution in the United States. And so Pennsylvania, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but a lot of times we sort of think about like religion in the United States as being sort of monolithic, like that it was, one Christian nation where everybody in the early colonies sort of like adhered to the same Christian principles. And that's really not true. While Christianity is the dominant religion in the United States, there are many different sects of Christianity throughout the colonies. So, for example, Maryland, Catholic, Virginia, they were what was known as Anglican, which is today is known as Episcopal. So it's sort of like a reflection of the Anglican Church in England. And in the some of the southern colonies, the rise of Baptists, right? But Pennsylvania is a Quaker. That was the main religion in in Pennsylvania. And the Quakers were a Christian sect, but that they, really had a different way of practicing Christianity. As we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. The Quakers were non-hierarchical. There wasn't like a clearly identified leader of the church, like a pope or a cardinal or a priest, or a pastor. Quaker churches were really sort of non-hierarchical. That they believed that God shines in everybody, and everybody has the capacity to express a relationship to God, and that you don't need like a hierarchy, a person in the hierarchy to sort of explain God's word to people, that everybody had that capacity. So it was sort of like progressive in a way. Quakers were also, they didn't see gender differentiations. They recognized gender differentiations, but they weren't like only men can be in the church and not women. Men and women played equal roles within Quakerism. And also, Quakers were pacifists, okay, and and they were looked down upon by the other colonies. In fact, they were the product of religious persecution, and in fact, those who were like leaving other colonies, would come to Pennsylvania to get like some safe haven. Not just Quakers, but other persecuted out religious groups. And so keep that in mind as we're sort of learning about the Pennsylvania model in a second. William Penn, leader within Pennsylvania, was a Quaker, and other Quakers at this time were wanting to reform the criminal justice code in Pennsylvania. That, as I stated in the last slide, that the main form of punishment at this time period was physical punishment, right? Whether that it was execution or some sort of bodily damage, or public being in the stockades, etc. It was all sort of like a public display of punishment associated with bodily harm as well. And the Quakers, as pacifists, were against that kind of bodily harm. And so William Penn, in his reforming of the criminal justice system code in Pennsylvania, they forbid the use of physical punishment, and that torturing, mutilating, branding, putting people in stocks, that was forbidden. And what William Penn required was that all counties must build houses of correction, that these houses of corrections were like modern jails, that the punishment was going to be incapacitation, not punishment being some sort of physical form of violence. Okay. And so, the early sort of foundations for the modern penal institutions are found in the reforms that William Penn made. So, as it says there, it provides the foundations for the modern correctional system in the United States. Now, your textbook talks about how, as the United States begins to develop a modern correctional system, that there are two competing approaches to the correctional models. One is the Pennsylvania system. We'll talk about that first. And the other is the Auburn system. So let's take a look at these two systems. Now, the reforms that William Penn put into place in the early 1700s, they didn't stay in place for very long. Those reforms were repealed, and there was a return in Pennsylvania back to physical punishment and execution. But after the Revolutionary War, in the 1770s and 80s, Pennsylvania returns to the Penn Penal Code reforms, forbidding the use of physical punishment. And in the 1780s and 90s, under the leadership of Benjamin Rush and a Quaker group called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, they basically returned to the focus on getting rid of physical punishment, paying more attention to the incapacitation as a form of punishment, but making sure that these penal institutions were more humane and less miserable than they were previously. And so the reforms that were sought by Benjamin Rush and the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, they were really a reflection of core Quaker beliefs. Like I mentioned in a previous slide, that there's this that Quakers believe that there's a capacity for grace in the light of God in all humans. They also put a premium on the importance of silent reflection. If you've ever been to a Quaker meeting, their religious meetings are silent. There's no liturgy, there's no like prayer book that you follow. You just seriously, you go in, you sit down in a circle of chairs, and you sit in silence, and you can meditate on really whatever you want. And then people, as they're sort of struck, if they want to, share a personal reflection about God, they stand up and they say it and they sit down. And then after a period of time, you sing some songs. Okay. And so keep those two things in mind as you're learning about sort of the way in which the Pennsylvania system of prisons is organized. They also, the changes that they demanded was to make penal systems more humane. One is that you limited the use of the death penalty to only the most severe crimes, such as murder and rape. And for other crimes, create institutions that were capable of actually rehabilitating individuals. Okay, so let's look at the goals of the Pennsylvania system and how the prison that they create hopes to achieve those goals. So, what were the goals of the Pennsylvania system? Well, the main goal was penitence. In other words, they wanted to create a condition that allows the inmate to find sorrow or forgiveness for the sin or the crime that they that participated in. And so that's penitence, is basically recognizing what you did was wrong, feeling remorse and sorrow for that, and then possibly making amends. And so the goal is to create conditions in the prison that allow for this solitary reflection on what you did, gives you the tools necessary for spiritual growth, and so that you are ready to engage in penitence, the remorse for what you did. And when you look at in the textbook, the way the prison is set up reflects these goals. That individuals were placed in solitary cells, and so you didn't share your cell with anybody else, and you didn't leave your cell. Okay, you were in your cell. You didn't leave for meals. You didn't leave for work. That your cell was your prison, basically. And these were self-sufficient cells. That they had running water. They had flushing toilets, which your textbook talks about how, like, a lot of people at the time did not have those sorts of amenities. They were heated, that skylights were placed in the top of the cell so that you could look up at the sky and the stars in the heavens, because they felt that this was a part of spiritual growth. And that there was access to your own private outdoor yard. You couldn't be with other people in the yard. You were there by yourself, but you did have access to the outside world. And that you had access to the Bible, key to spiritual growth. And also the prisoners did meaningful work within their cell, and like handicrafts of making shoes, or clothing, or some sort of meaningful handwork endeavor. And that the prisoners were, it was very quiet, solitary, setting up the stage for contemplation, and hopefully with the idea of creating a person capable for re-entry into society. Prisoners were surveilled, but not overtly, which could actually be a little creepy, I guess. But it wasn't like prison guards were walking up and down and staring into your cell. And having overt sort of surveillance from you. Sometimes they would just like secretly peep into your cell. You wouldn't know. Or there would be one guard that would maybe surveil many of the cells. But the surveillance was not overt. It was more implicit, or you knew it was there. You knew that you were being surveilled, but it didn't create this dynamic between the inmate and the jailer. New York follows a different system, and it's known as the Auburn System. The goal of the Auburn system is crime prevention through fear of punishment and silent confinement. Uh, an additional goal is that you basically present a very regimented, sort of militaristic living situation for criminals, and it's through that sort of regimentation that they can like turn away from their criminal ways. That achieving this goal of preventing crime or reforming criminals through fear of punishment and silent confinement was achieved through military regimentation. Sorry about that. It's the end of the semester. Can't hardly talk anymore. And so inmates would all get up at the same time. Inmates would eat food at the same time, eat meals at the same time. They would be marched back and forth between their work areas, right? And so it was a prisoner's life was very regimented. There was congregate work, and so you were with others. So you would do congregate work during the day, silent confinement at night. But even that congregate work was supposed to be silent during meals, silent during work, lots of presence of guards to make sure that the regimentation was followed. The surveillance was more overt. Your textbook talks about how it was the Auburn system has a tiered system where you have corridor on top of corridor on top of corridor of prison cells. And so guards, you could see into all of the cells, and then the guards could walk the corridors, making sure that that there was this sort of overt monitoring by the guards. And if you didn't follow the rules, you got a severe punishment, and that severe punishment was solitary confinement, right? And so, this sort of thinking that maybe some people are just not capable of any sort of reform, and if they're not capable of that, they're just going to be placed in really inhumane solitary confinement conditions. So let's compare the Pennsylvania and the Auburn system. In the Pennsylvania system, it assumes that rehabilitation can be found within one's own self, right? That if you create conditions for an offender for them to contemplate what they did and give them the spiritual guidance that they need through the Bible, and in fact, you're not even teaching the Bible to them, they're just reading the Bible on their own, that they have the capacity for change. And so really it sort of has a more positive view of human nature because it assumes that with right conditions that a person can reform themselves. The Auburn system has a different approach or sort of attitude towards human nature. It assumes that rehabilitation comes more overtly through the state, in particular through this regimented, more direct control, so that if inmates are sort of left to their own contemplations, that they're just going to contemplate being worse criminals, maybe, right? There's not that capacity for rehabilitation within each self. But the state has to sort of be there, like regimenting you, making sure you get up, making sure you're doing your work, and having more direct control. And if you fail, then you're going to be directly punished through a solitary confinement. So really different sort of approaches to human nature. One of the downsides of the Pennsylvania model is that it underplays the impact of isolation. So it's sort of like optimistic in terms of a person's capacity to reform themselves, but it doesn't really recognize that people with severe mental infirmities, that isolation could really be the worst thing for them. It would make their condition worse, not better. The Auburn system underplays the impact of constant fear and the potential defiance when faced with that kind of onslaught of control from the state. And so that it overlooks the fact that if you're constantly being surveilled, constantly being regimented, constantly being like, if you don't do it, you're going to be punished, that maybe doesn't lead to reform, but that could lead to actual defiance, digging in and becoming actually more criminal in a way, because you're kind of faced with a lot of state control over your own autonomy. The Pennsylvania model, religion is a guiding philosophy, in particular Quakerism. And the Auburn system, the military is the guiding philosophy, that there is some value to taking away people's like personal identity and replacing it with the regimentation of a military sort of lifestyle. Okay, in conclusion, it's the last slide of the semester, so I thought I'd have a little bit of fun, and I thought I'd bring back in my husband, who you've seen before. Before you saw him and he was big beard Mike, and now it's just he got his beard trimmed, so he's medium beard Mike. And so Mike's going to come and answer a question about which system that he would prefer if he was incarcerated. Now, it should come as no surprise to you that the Auburn system is the one adopted by the United States as the model for prisons. As you're learning about the maximum security, super maximum security prisons, medium and minimum, you're going to see that the Auburn approach is reflected in all of those prisons you'll be learning about. But let's ask the question. Okay, Mike, if you are incarcerated, which model would you prefer? Would you rather be incarcerated in a prison that adopts the Pennsylvania model or the Auburn model? Which would you choose?
I think I would choose the Pennsylvania model.
You would? Why?
Well, just because I do think that change comes from the inside rather than the outside primarily. Although one of the things I've been thinking about recently in my own life is the difference between languishing and flourishing. And I also think that maybe if you have a goal, maybe a state goal, maybe you're more likely to flourish and make those changes. So I'm actually not sure what I would say should be the end, but I guess let's go with Pennsylvania.
Okay. I think I would choose Pennsylvania too. I feel like if I was in prison and I was with a bunch of other people, I'd be scared all the time. And if I was in prison and I was in my own silent cell and I could read and contemplate and go outside and look at the stars, I think that would be better in terms of my ability to re-enter society.
But maybe if you're in your own private cell, you would just nap all the time. So maybe
it's possible.
Maybe if
right.
you were with other people, you would be more focused to get up and do activities and actually make some changes in your life.
Right. I think you raised some really good points about the benefits and the drawbacks of each of the styles. Well, thanks, Mike, for participating in the last slide.
Okay. Good luck, students.
And thanks for listening, you guys, throughout the course of the semester. I really appreciate your attention. Bye-bye.